The morning Joseph Brooks found the charred skeleton of his barn still smoking against the pale Montana sky, he made a silent vow to himself that he would not accept a single hand from another living soul, and he kept that vow with a stubbornness that bordered on destruction. That was in the spring of 1882, when the grasslands around the town of Harlow Creek were just beginning to green up after a brutal winter, and the whole valley smelled like new earth and possibility. The fire had taken the barn, taken his prize stallion, taken 3 of his best milk cows, and very nearly taken the farmhouse itself. It had also taken something invisible, something in the center of Joseph that had previously allowed him to look other men in the eye without flinching. Now when they came riding out with lumber on their wagons and concern on their faces, he sent them away. When Pastor Elias drove over from the church with a basket of food and an offer to organize a community rebuild, Joseph thanked him with a tight jaw and a closed door. When his nearest neighbor, old Pete Calloway, showed up 2 mornings running with his 2 grown sons and a set of tools, Joseph told him plainly that he had it handled. He did not have it handled. Anyone riding the East Road into Harlow Creek who happened to glance toward the Brooks property could see that plainly. The blackened timber jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The paddock fence leaned at an angle that suggested it might surrender entirely to the next strong wind. The remaining chickens wandered freely because the coop door hung from one hinge. Joseph himself was thinner than he had been before the fire, leaner in a way that did not suggest fitness, but rather the slow erosion of a man who cooked for himself without enthusiasm and slept in a bed he had never intended to sleep in alone. His wife, Ellen, had passed the autumn before the fire. Fever had taken her in October, quick and merciless, leaving Joseph with a 4-year-old daughter named Me and a grief that he had not begun to understand how to carry. He had been managing. That was what people said about him. Joseph Brooks is managing in the careful tone people use when they mean the opposite. And then the fire came in March, and the managing became a great deal more complicated. Me stayed with Pete Calloway's wife, Dorothea, during the days. That arrangement Joseph had agreed to without pride getting in the way, because he understood, at least on some level, that a child could not be left to wander a property with nails in the dirt and a well that needed a new cover. He drove her over himself in the mornings in the wagon and collected her in the evenings, and in between those 2 moments, he worked his land with the grim focus of a man who believed that hard labor was the only honest answer to an impossible situation. Cora Easton arrived in Harlow Creek on the 14th of May, 1882, on the afternoon stage from Billings. She came with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a canvas satchel, and a composure so complete that the station agent, a fussy man named Harold Cribb, could not determine whether she was coming to stay or merely passing through. She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair pinned back under a practical hat, and eyes the color of the creek itself in summer, that particular shade of gray-green that changes depending on the light and the weather. She was not small, and she was not large. She was a woman who looked as though she had carried things before and expected to carry things again. She had come from Missouri, from a town called Calabend, where she had taught school for 3 years following the death of her father, who had been a carpenter and a good one. Her mother had died when Cora was 12. She had 2 brothers, both older, both settled with families in the eastern states, both of whom had written letters suggesting she come back east and find herself a sensible situation. She had written back that she intended to be her own sensible situation, and then she had answered an advertisement posted by the Harlow Creek School Board for a teacher, and here she was. The schoolhouse was on the north end of town, a single-room building that smelled of chalk and pine, and the particular mustiness of books that had been rained on and dried improperly. Cora walked the length of it the morning after her arrival, running her fingers along the desktops, noting where the stovepipe needed caulking, counting the textbooks, assessing the state of the chalk supply. She had a room at the boarding house run by Marvella Poole, a woman of 50 who asked 3 questions per minute and never waited for the answers. Cora liked her immediately. The town itself was the sort of place that was still deciding what it wanted to be. Harlow Creek had a main street with a dry goods store, a livery, a saloon called the Red Diamond, a doctor's office, the church, a sheriff's office, and enough houses spreading out from the main street to suggest genuine ambition. The railroad had come through 20 miles south 2 years prior, and the town had felt the pull of it. Some people leaving, new people arriving, everyone in a state of mid-sentence, as though a thought had been interrupted and not yet resumed. It was Marvella who told Cora about Joseph Brooks, about 3 days after Cora's arrival. They were sitting at the kitchen table in the evening after supper, when Marvella poured them each a cup of strong coffee and said, in the particular tone she reserved for genuinely interesting subjects, "You know there is a man out on the East Road who is going to work himself into the ground by July if someone does not do something useful." Cora turned her cup in her hands. "What sort of man?" Marvella told her. "The wife, the fever, the fire, the stubbornness, the little girl, the offers refused, the property going to ruin." She told it plainly, without excessive sentiment, in the way of a woman who had lived long enough to know that facts speak more honestly than decoration. Cora listened to all of it. She did not say much. She asked a few quiet questions. How old was the child? Was the land good land? Had the man been a successful farmer before? And then she thanked Marvella for the coffee and went to bed. She thought about it while she lay in the dark listening to the wind move through the grass outside her window. She thought about a man who refused help, and she thought about all the reasons a person might do that. Pride was the obvious answer, and pride was certainly part of it, but she did not think it was all of it. She thought about grief, and how grief sometimes wears the face of pride because pride is more manageable than grief. She thought about her father who had refused help after her mother died, not openly, not with words, but with the slow withdrawal of a man who believed that accepting assistance was the same as admitting defeat. She had watched him do it. She had been 12 years old and helpless to stop it. She was 26 now and not helpless at all. The following Saturday morning, Cora Easton did not ask Joseph Brooks if she could come to his property. She did not send word ahead. She did not consult with Marvella or Pete Calloway or anyone else in town. She borrowed a horse from the livery, loaded her saddlebag with a decent supply of nails, a hammer that had belonged to her father, a jar of grease for hinges, and a fresh-baked loaf of bread that Marvella pressed into her hands without comment, and she rode out the East Road. She found the property exactly as she had been told to expect it: the charred timber, the fence, the wandering chickens. She found Joseph himself around the side of the house, attempting to shore up the well cover with pieces of wood that were not quite the right size. He was 31 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had grown a little long and a jaw that had gone unshaved for longer than was strictly intentional. He looked up when he heard hoofbeats, and the look on his face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, assessment, the beginning of a polite refusal forming on his lips. Cora swung down from the horse before he could speak. She tied the horse to the paddock post, pulled the hammer and the jar of nails from her saddlebag, walked past Joseph without making eye contact, and went directly to the coop door that was hanging from one hinge. Joseph stood for a moment watching her. "Ma'am," he said. She crouched down and examined the hinge. It was not broken, merely pulled away from the wood where the screws had loosened. She found the right nail, she had brought a selection, and began working. "Ma'am," he said again, louder. "The chickens are going to be somebody's supper if this door stays open," she said pleasantly, without looking up. "I expect it is not who you intend." He walked toward her with the posture of a man who had made a decision. "I appreciate you coming out, but I do not need the fence on the east side," she said, still not looking up, the hammer doing its precise work. "3 posts are listing. I can see it from here. If a horse gets out through that, you will spend 2 days chasing it." She set the screwdriver she had also brought her father's with the worn handle against the loosened screw and applied pressure. "I am not here to help you, Mr. Brooks. I am here because I needed somewhere to practice my fence mending." He stopped walking. She risked a glance over her shoulder at him, brief and neutral. "I am Cora Easton. I am the new school teacher. I used to be a carpenter's daughter, and I am finding that boarding house life leaves me with insufficient use for my hands on Saturdays." She returned to the hinge. "Go back to your well cover. I can see it needs a different piece of wood." There was a very long silence. Then, improbably, Joseph Brooks went back to his well cover. He did not say thank you. He did not make any further objection. He worked on the well cover with a careful, contained fury and kept his back to her. And Cora fixed the coop door with a thoroughness that would outlast the building itself. And then she moved to the paddock fence and began there. Came back with Dorothea Calloway around midday. Cora had moved on to the fence by then, working her way along the east side with the methodical patience of someone who finds physical labor genuinely satisfying. Me was a small girl with Joseph's dark hair and eyes that had the particular solemn quality of children who have lost a parent young. She stood at the edge of the paddock and watched Cora work. "What are you doing?" Me asked. "Fixing the fence," Cora said. "Papa said the fence needed fixing." He was right. Me considered this. "Are you friends with Papa?" Cora looked at her for a moment. "Not yet," she said honestly. Me nodded as though this were a satisfactory answer and went to find her father. Dorothea Calloway, who had driven me back in her buggy and had no intention of leaving without acquiring the full story, came and stood near the fence with her hands folded. She was a round-faced woman with kind eyes and the particular competence of someone who had been running a frontier household for 30 years. "Well," Dorothea said. "Good afternoon," Cora said, not stopping her work. "He did not send you away." "No," Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "The Henderson boys came out 2 weeks ago with a full load of lumber. He sent them home inside of 5 minutes." "I did not ask," Cora said simply. "I just started." Dorothea was silent for a second longer, and then she laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that startled a crow out of the nearby cottonwood. "Well, God bless you," she said, and got back in her buggy looking as satisfied as if she had just solved a difficult equation. Cora left that evening as the sun was going flat and golden across the grass, the bread she had brought set on Joseph's porch without comment. He did not say goodbye. She did not expect it. She rode back to Harlow Creek in the long, lovely light of the Montana spring evening and felt something she recognized as the particular satisfaction of work done well. She came back the following Saturday. He did not tell her to leave. By the third Saturday, he handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, a gesture so mechanical it was clearly muscle memory from a time when he had done it as a matter of course. And then he looked at the cup in his extended hand with an expression of faint surprise at himself. She took the cup without comment. They drank coffee standing 10 feet apart near the half-reconstructed paddock fence, looking at the work that remained. And for the first time in what felt to Joseph like a very long time, the work that remained felt merely like work, rather than like evidence of failure. Me had taken to following Cora around the property during these Saturday visits, offering opinions on the work in progress with the serious authority of a 4-year-old who has decided she is in charge of quality control. "That post is still a little bit crooked," Me said one afternoon, squinting at the fence with professional concern. "You are absolutely right," Cora said. "Hand me that mallet." Me fetched the mallet with great importance. Joseph, working on the new animal shelter he was framing up where the barn had been, watched this exchange from 20 feet away, with an expression he was not aware of, wearing something that had begun to soften at the edges of its habitual severity. It was the animal shelter that broke the silence between them properly. It was the 4th Saturday of June. The shelter was coming along, but Joseph had reached the point in the framing where a second pair of hands was genuinely necessary. Cora could see it from where she was recaulking the window frame on the farmhouse, watching him try to hold the top beam in place while simultaneously driving a nail. It was physically impossible. He knew it was physically impossible. She could tell from the set of his jaw that he had been aware of this problem for some time and had not resolved how to address it. She finished the window frame, cleaned her tools with a rag, walked over to the shelter framing, and took hold of the beam without saying anything. He looked at her. She looked at the beam and held it level with both hands. He drove the nail. They worked the rest of that afternoon side by side without conversation, and the silence was a different quality of silence from all the previous ones. It was the silence of two people who are working together toward the same end, and it had a companionable warmth to it that neither of them remarked upon but both of them noticed. At the end of the day, when she was putting her tools back in her saddlebag and he was covering the fresh lumber against the possibility of overnight rain, he said, without looking at her, "I did not ask your opinion on the door placement." "No," she agreed, hanging the saddlebag over the pommel. "It is further east than I intended. It is better placed further east. The wind comes predominantly from the northwest. The animals will be better sheltered." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know which direction the wind comes from?" I paid attention. She checked the cinch on the saddle. "I have been coming out here 6 Saturdays. He turned and looked at her then, and it was the first time he had looked at her directly, without the slight avoidance he had maintained, as though direct eye contact were something he needed to ration. She met his gaze steadily. "The door placement is better east," he said finally. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. She could see it happen and then stop, like a door that opens an inch and then closes again because whoever is behind it is not quite ready. But she had seen it, and she noted it with the quiet pleasure of someone who understands that real change happens in increments. The summer moved the way Montana summers do, with an exuberance that feels like an apology for the winter, everything growing fast and vivid, the light lasting until 9 o'clock in the evenings, the creek running full and cold from the snowmelt. Cora taught school Monday through Friday, 31 children ranging from age 5 to 14, and she discovered quickly that teaching in Harlow Creek required a different set of skills than teaching in Missouri. 3 of her students came to school barefoot because they owned 1 pair of shoes, and those were reserved for Sunday. 2 of her students were helping to support their families with work at the mill and came to class so tired they fell asleep over their slates, and Cora let them sleep, quietly teaching around them, and made sure they had something to eat. She became a known figure in the town fairly quickly. She was not gregarious in the way that some people are. She did not fill every silence with chatter. She did not seek out company for its own sake. But she was reliably herself everywhere she went, and people respond to that kind of consistency. She sat in the same pew at church every Sunday behind the Callaways. She drank her coffee at Marvella's table and listened to the gossip with genuine interest while contributing nothing inflammatory. She helped load a wagon for old Mrs. Ferris, whose husband had taken a bad fall, and then she sat with Mrs. Ferris for an hour and helped her write a letter to her son in Denver, because Mrs. Ferris's eyes were going, and she could no longer read her own handwriting. On Saturdays, she rode out to the Brooks property. Joseph was making progress. The animal shelter was enclosed now, properly roofed, the right size for the 4 cows he intended to acquire when he had the money, and the 3 horses he had managed to hold onto through everything. The paddock fence was sound. The coop was repaired and fully functional, the chickens confined as they should be. The well cover fit properly. The house itself, which had not been touched by the fire, was looking better maintained than it had in some time, shutters rehung, the porch steps replaced where 2 of them had been giving dangerously. They had developed a pattern now, Joseph and Cora, that had not been discussed or negotiated, but simply evolved the way patterns do between 2 people who spend time together regularly. She arrived around 9 in the morning. He would have been working for 2 hours already, but when he heard her horse on the road he would stop and go inside and come back out with 2 cups of coffee. They would drink the coffee standing near whichever work was most current, and she would ask a direct question. "What are we doing today? using the we without particular emphasis, but not without intention. And he would tell her the plan, also without particular emphasis, but with an increasing directness, as though the answer to that question was no longer something he needed to think about. Me spent her Saturdays now at home rather than at the Callaways, because her father was there and Cora was there, and Saturdays had become something she looked forward to the way children look forward to things that are both ordinary and wonderful simultaneously. She helped where she could, fetching tools, handing up nails, carrying small loads of cut wood. She had also appointed herself the person responsible for Cora's horse, leading it to the water trough when Cora arrived and checking its feed with a level of seriousness that Cora found entirely charming. In July, during the week between the 4th and the 10th, there was a lightning storm that came through the valley 3 nights running, and the 3rd night it brought hail that stripped the early vegetable garden down to stalks. Cora heard about it at church on Sunday morning, in the general exchange of damage reports that follows any significant weather event. Joseph was not at church. He almost never came, and she had never asked why, though she suspected it was connected to the fact that the last time the whole community had gathered around him it had been for his wife's funeral. On Monday afternoon, after school let out, she rode east instead of back to the boarding house. She found Joseph standing in the garden looking at the wreckage with the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic and finding that the numbers do not add up. She got down off her horse. She stood beside him and looked at the stripped garden. "Beans are gone," he said. "Yes." "Tomato starts, all of them." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. The late afternoon heat lay on the valley like a pressing hand. "I had just about had the food situation in hand," he said, and his voice was different from its usual controlled flatness. There was something raw and tired in it, a single layer pulled back that he had not meant to pull back. Cora stood next to him in the ruined garden, and she did not say it will be all right, and she did not say at least you have this or look on the bright side of that. She said, "I have seeds. I brought too many from Missouri because I could not decide what to leave behind. Beets, carrots, a second planting of beans. It is late but not too late for beets and carrots. The beans will have a short season but they will produce." He looked at her. "I also have tomato plants on the windowsill of my room at Marvella's," she continued. "She has been threatening to move them to the parlor. I expect she will be glad of the excuse to be rid of them." Something shifted in his face. Not the door opening a little and closing again this time, but something more fundamental, some rearrangement of what he had been holding and how he had been holding it. "You kept plants in your room," he said. "I always keep plants in my room. It is a habit I have had since I was a child. At a boarding house. Marvella has been very tolerant." She looked at the garden. "I will bring the seeds in the start Saturday. The beds are not ruined. It is just a matter of replanting." He turned toward her fully for the first time that afternoon. The light was coming from the west at an angle that caught the planes of his face, and she could see very clearly in that moment how tired he was, not from the day's work but from a deeper tiredness that had been accumulating for months, since October at least, perhaps longer. She saw it and did not look away from it, and something about her not looking away seemed to be, for him, the important thing. "Cora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "Joseph," she said equally simply. "I do not know." He stopped, started again. "I am not very good at—" "I know," she said. "It does not matter." He looked at her for another moment, and then he looked back at the garden and he said, "I will turn the beds over tonight so they are ready." "Good," she said. She rode back to town in the long summer evening feeling something she had not felt in a considerable time, a warm, particular tenderness that she recognized from stories, from the way her mother used to look at her father, from every love story she had ever read, which was to say she recognized it as the thing that had been coming for some time now, the thing she had been watching grow the way you watch something in a garden, with patience and attention, not forcing it, just making sure the conditions are right. She turned it over in her mind without rushing it. The seeds and the tomato starts went in on Saturday, the three of them working the beds, Cora and Joseph side by side, me following behind and pressing seeds into the earth with the careful deliberateness of a child who understands she has been given real responsibility. It was domestic in a way that none of them commented on, but that sat between them with a particular weight, the specific weight of things that could be one way or another and have not yet decided. In the evenings, after the work, Joseph had begun making supper. Not elaborate suppers. He was a competent but not inspired cook, but real meals, set at the table, with me sitting properly and a lamp lit, and the windows open to the summer evening air. He had begun including Cora in these meals without making a formal announcement about it, simply setting 3 places instead of 2, and she had begun staying for them without making a formal announcement about that either. They talked at those meals. Carefully at first, the way you talk when you are both aware that conversation is a kind of bridge building, and you are not sure yet how much weight the bridge will hold. He asked about Missouri, about what it had been like to grow up with a carpenter for a father. She told him about learning to use tools before she could read, about the smell of sawdust, about the way her father could look at a piece of wood and see what it could be. He listened with the focused quality of a man who has been listening mostly to silence for a long time and finds conversation newly interesting. She asked about the ranch, how long he had had it, what it had been before the fire, what he intended it to be. He told her about Ellen, which surprised her and perhaps surprised him. He mentioned her carefully, like someone handling something precious that is also fragile. But he mentioned her the way she had wanted to plant an orchard along the western fence line, the way she had been the one who named the horses ridiculous names that he had complained about and then quietly kept using. Me's name had been Ellen's choice. Cora listened to all of it without interruption, and when he was done she said, "She sounds like someone worth missing," and his face did something complicated and then settled into something simpler, something that might have been gratitude. On the last Saturday of July, the shelter was finished. It was a proper structure, better than the barn that had burned, because Cora had suggested some modifications to the design that Joseph had initially resisted and then incorporated without comment. It was wider, with better ventilation for summer, and the door was hung on heavy iron hardware that would not fail in the wind. Standing back and looking at it in the late afternoon light, it looked like the kind of building that intended to be there for a long time. Joseph stood next to Cora looking at it. Me stood between them, one hand holding each of theirs in a gesture she had made without thinking, the way small children move toward the people they feel safe with. "It is a good building," Cora said. "It is," Joseph agreed. Me swung their joined hands forward and back small arc. "Can we eat supper now?" she asked. Cora felt Joseph's hand still holding Me's by extension close to hers, and she was aware of a very specific kind of awareness, the kind that had been present for some weeks now but had been patient, waiting for its moment. She looked up at him. He was already looking at her, and he had that expression she had come to know, the door opening, deciding whether to open further. "Supper," he said, as though confirming a plan. "Yes." They went inside. After supper, after Me was put to bed, they sat on the porch in the July dark, which in Montana is never truly dark in summer, just a long, deep blue that smells of grass and distance. There was a lamp on the windowsill behind them that made warm patterns on the porch boards. The creek somewhere to the south was audible if you were quiet. They were quiet for a while. Then Joseph said, "I have not been easy company." "No," Cora agreed pleasantly. He looked at her sideways. "You are not going to argue with that. Would you like me to?" He was quiet again. Then slowly, as though each word required its own individual effort of will, "I do not know what I would do without these Saturdays." She heard it for what it was. She turned and looked at him fully, and she saw the effort it had cost him to say it and the relief that it was said. "Neither do I," she told him. He looked at the dark grass for a long moment, then he looked at her. His jaw worked slightly the way it did when he was choosing words carefully. "Cora, I want to." Another pause. I'm not sure what I have to offer exactly. The property is still Joseph, she said. He stopped. I did not come out here 6 Saturdays ago because I needed somewhere to practice fence mending, she said. He was very still. I came because Marvella Poole told me about a man who was managing badly all by himself, and it seemed like a solvable problem. She paused. And then it turned into a different thing entirely, and I am glad of it. He exhaled slowly, and it was the exhale of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has just been given permission to let it go. He reached out slowly and took her hand, not Me's hand this time, hers, directly, his large, work-roughened hand closing carefully around her fingers as though he was aware of the gravity of the gesture. She let him hold it. She held it back. They stayed on the porch until the blue dark deepened enough to call it night, and the lamp on the windowsill burned steady, and the creek ran on in the distance, and neither of them said anything more that needed saying, because some things are said without words and said completely. The following morning, Sunday, Joseph Brooks came to church. He sat in the pew directly across the aisle from Cora, with Me between him and the wall, Me in her good dress with her hair combed, looking pleased with herself in the way that children do when they know something significant is happening even if they cannot name it. When Cora came in and took her usual place, she looked across the aisle and found him already looking back, and they exchanged a look that had nothing to do with the Sunday morning service and everything to do with the previous night's porch, and Cora faced forward with a warmth in her chest that she had no intention of minimizing. Dorothea Calloway, who was sitting one row ahead and saw all of this clearly, spent the entire service working very hard to look devout. After church in the yard, Pete Calloway shook Joseph's hand and said, with the careful neutrality of a man being deliberately neutral, "Good to see you, Joseph," and Joseph said, with a warmth that Pete had not heard from him in some time, "Good to be seen, Pete." And that was that, the town absorbing this small change in the way that small towns absorb changes, through the gradual adjustment of everyone's understanding of how things are. In August, Joseph rode into town on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual, and stopped at the schoolhouse during the afternoon break when the children were outside. Cora was at her desk working through the arithmetic assessments she had given that morning. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. He had his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has prepared something and is now questioning the preparation. "I came to ask you something," he said. "Come in," she said. She set down her marking pencil. He came in. He stood near the front of the classroom with the particular out-of-place quality that adults have in schoolrooms, everything sized for smaller people, the light coming through windows placed for shorter eyes. He looked around the room for a moment, the alphabet on the wall, the maps, the slates stacked neatly near the stove, and something about it seemed to settle him. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said, "at the hotel dining room on Saturday evening if you would agree to that." Cora looked at him. He was attempting a formal stillness and not entirely succeeding. There was a slight tension in his jaw and his hands were not quite still on the hat brim. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He nodded. The tension in his jaw eased. He turned the hat over in his hands once, twice. "I will come by the boarding house at 6. I will be ready." He nodded again, more definitely, the way you nod when a difficult thing has gone better than expected. And then he put his hat on and went back out, and Cora heard his horse moving away down the street, and she sat for a moment at her desk with her hands flat on the marking work, and a smile on her face that she was in no hurry to put away. Saturday dinner at the hotel dining room was, by the standards of Harlow Creek in 1882, as fine an evening out as the town could offer. The hotel dining room had tablecloths and actual candles, and a menu that the chef, a man named DuPont who had come west from New Orleans for reasons he kept private, took very seriously. Joseph arrived at Marvella's at 6 o'clock in a good jacket that had been well brushed and a shirt that was clean and pressed, and Marvella opened the door and looked at him for a moment with an expression of pure satisfaction before calling up the stairs. Cora came down in a dress she had made herself, deep blue wool challis that she had been saving for something, though she had not known for what until now. She had her hair down from its usual practical arrangement, coiled back at the neck with the kind of simplicity that is harder to achieve than it looks. She watched Joseph see her and watched his face do the thing that faces do when they encounter something they did not quite expect and find it better than any expectation. "You look very fine," he said. It was not a smooth compliment. It was plainly and honestly meant, with no performance in it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Marvella watched them walk down the street toward the hotel with her arms folded and the expression of a woman who has done something good and is aware of it. Dinner was 2 hours long and covered, between them, a range of topics that included the best way to winter a root cellar, the peculiarity of Montana weather compared to their respective home states, the education theories of Horace Mann which Cora had strong opinions about, and the question of whether Harlow Creek would eventually become significant or remain the particular kind of small. They disagreed on the weather comparison. She found Montana less severe than he described, which he attributed to her not having experienced a full winter yet, which she conceded was fair. They agreed on the root cellar. They disagreed quite pleasantly on Horace Mann, which surprised Joseph, who had not expected to have opinions about educational theory, and found, in conversation with Cora, that he had several. He walked her back to the boarding house in the warm August dark, and at the gate he held it open for her and she paused, and there was the particular pause of two people who are at the edge of something and both aware of it. "Joseph," she said. "Cora," he said, in the same tone, which was not quite a question but not quite a statement either. He leaned down and kissed her, very carefully, with the unhurried quality of a man who knows what he is doing and is doing it with full intention. She kissed him back with the same quality, her hand finding the lapel of his good jacket. When they separated, she looked up at him in the warm dark and said, with some amusement and a great deal of warmth, "You should have done that on the porch in July." "I know," he said. "I am a slow mover." "I noticed," she said. He smiled. It was a full smile this time, no door stopping halfway, complete, genuine, the smile of a man who has come back from somewhere difficult and found something unexpectedly good waiting. It changed his face considerably. She went inside. He walked back to where he had left his horse at the livery, and the night around him was full of the sounds of the town settling into itself. A distant piano from the Red Diamond, a dog somewhere, the wind moving through the cottonwoods, and he felt, for the first time since the previous October, as though the world had a logic to it that made sense. The rest of August and all of September were a kind of unfolding, the way seasons unfold when they are going in the right direction. Joseph and Cora saw each other on Saturdays as before, but now there was nothing ambiguous about the nature of the Saturdays. She still worked when she came. She was constitutionally incapable of sitting idle on a property where work needed doing, and he worked alongside her, and the work itself had become something different from labor. It had the quality of collaboration, of two people building something together, and the building was not only literal. He came into town twice a week. On Tuesday evenings, he came by the boarding house and they sat in Marvella's parlor, which Marvella vacated with an elaborate pretense of having things to do elsewhere, and they talked for 2 or 3 hours. On Thursday evenings he began taking her to the Red Diamond for a meal, and on to the church hall if there was a social gathering, which in September there often was, the harvest dances, the potluck suppers, the fiddle evenings that the town organized as a hedge against the coming isolation of winter. They danced at the first harvest dance, and dancing with Joseph, Cora discovered, was a revelation. He moved with the natural ease of someone who had learned young and liked it, and she was a good dancer herself, and there is a particular rightness to dancing with someone whose instincts match yours that goes beyond the steps. When the fiddle player, a young man named Declan Hart who had come from Texas, moved into a slow air between the faster pieces, Joseph's arm around her waist pulled her closer than the dance technically required, and she let it, and the room around them receded to a pleasant blur. Dorothea Calloway told Pete afterward that it was like watching two rivers finally join up that had been running toward each other for months. In October, on a crisp evening when the aspens had gone to gold and the first suggestion of genuine cold was coming down from the mountains, Joseph said to Cora, sitting on the newly repaired porch where they had first held hands in the July dark, "I want to ask you something serious." She set down the mug of coffee she was holding and gave him her full attention. He was looking at the distance, at the way the gold aspens caught the last light, and then he turned and looked at her directly. "I know it has not been a long time," he said, "and I know the property is still not, it is not where I intend it to be, and I know I am not Joseph," she said gently. He stopped. "Ask me the question," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Cora Easton, will you marry me?" The aspens caught a breath of wind and spilled their gold. The creek murmured its perpetual commentary. The sky above the western ridge was the color of a banked fire. "Yes," she said. "Joseph Brooks, I will absolutely marry you." He took her face in both his hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting some time to do it with this level of conviction. She kissed him back with equal conviction and put her hands over his and the porch, the property, the Montana evening. All of it felt like the right place to be. Inside the house, me, who had been put to bed an hour ago and was manifestly not asleep, heard her father's voice and then Cora's voice, and then the quality of quiet that follows important conversation, and she lay in her bed and made up her own story about what had been said. And in the morning, when her father told her that Cora was going to come and live with them and be her mama, me sat very seriously for a moment, processing this, and then said, "I knew that." With the certainty of a 5-year-old who had in fact known that. The wedding was in November, the second Saturday of November, 1882. It was a clear, cold day, the sky the sharp specific blue of Montana winter light, and Pastor Elias married them in the church with what felt like the entire town present because what felt like the entire town was present. Marvella cried and said she was not crying. Dorothea Calloway cried without any pretense to the contrary. Pete Calloway shook Joseph's hand before the ceremony with a grip that communicated a volume of feeling that neither of them would have been able to put into words. Cora wore a dress of ivory wool that Marvella had helped her make over the previous 3 weeks, a proper wedding dress by the standards of Harlow Creek in 1882, which meant it was well made and fit exactly right, and had buttons up the back that Marvella had ordered from the dry goods store with a particular gleam in her eye. Joseph wore his good jacket and a new shirt, and had shaved with unusual care. Me stood beside Cora during the ceremony, holding a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had picked in the fall and saved for an occasion she had known was coming, and she watched Pastor Elias marry her father to Cora with the calm attention of a child who is witnessing something that settles the world correctly. "I, Cora Easton, take you, Joseph Brooks," Cora said, and her voice was steady and clear in the cold church, "to be my lawful husband, to have and to hold from this day forward." Joseph's voice, when his turn came, was steadier than she might have expected, and more tender than she had ever heard it in any context, and she thought, standing opposite him in the morning light, that this was the version of him that existed under all the other versions, the one he had been protecting. When Pastor Elias said, "You may kiss your bride," and Joseph kissed her, the church erupted with what could only be described as tremendous relief expressed as applause, and Declan Hart started playing his fiddle from the back pew, which was not strictly in the order of service, but was appreciated by everyone. The reception was in the church hall. There was food brought by what was, in fact, the entire town, pies and breads and roasted meats, and a cake that the hotel chef DuPont had made as a gift, and called it even with the universe. Joseph danced with Cora twice and then danced with me once, holding her up so her feet didn't touch the floor, swinging her in slow circles while she laughed the particular laugh of small children being spun, and Cora watched this with a feeling in her chest so large it was almost difficult to breathe around. They drove back to the property in the wagon in the afternoon, Cora between Joseph and me on the seat, the three of them wrapped in quilts against the November cold, the horses moving at a steady walk through the dry winter grass. The property looked different to Cora in a way that was not architectural. Nothing had changed since the morning but was entirely real. It looked like hers. It looked like home, in the specific way that home means the place where the people you love are. Joseph carried her over the threshold, which she had not expected, and which he executed with more ease than the occasion required, and me walked in right behind them, both announcing that she was also carrying Cora over the threshold, since she had helped. That first winter together was its own kind of education, the education of two people learning to share a daily life and finding it more possible than either of them had privately feared. Cora was not a naturally domestic woman in the way that the era expected its women to be domestic. She did not cook with particular inspiration, and she had strong opinions about the arrangement of the kitchen that Joseph initially found baffling. But she was thorough, and she was capable, and she brought an organizational intelligence to the household that it had been lacking. She also, crucially, found the humor in things. When the chimney backed up in December and filled the kitchen with smoke, she opened every window and stood in the cold kitchen laughing, and Joseph, who had been braced for catastrophe, found himself laughing too, which was not a response he had previously associated with chimney problems. He did the morning chores before dawn while she slept, a habit he had developed alone that he maintained because he liked the early quiet of the property, liked the routine of it. She made coffee in the mornings, the kind of strong, serious coffee she had learned from a woman in Missouri who claimed her grandmother had been a cook in New Orleans, and the first cup of morning coffee taken together at the kitchen table, in the early winter dark before me woke up, became one of the things Cora would think of later when she thought about happiness. That specific thing, that specific quiet, the sound of the wind and the smell of the coffee and Joseph across the table. She continued to teach, because the school board expected her to and because she wanted to. There had been a passing moment after the wedding when she had wondered if the expectation would be that she stop. It was not uncommon for married women to relinquish their teaching positions when they became wives. But Harlow Creek's school board, three practical men who valued a good teacher above social convention when the two came into conflict, made no such suggestion, and Joseph actively encouraged her to continue, with a directness that she found entirely characteristic and deeply appreciated. "The children need a teacher," he said when she raised the question. "Other women might feel otherwise about a married woman teaching." "Other women are not the school board," he said, with the slightly impatient logic that she had come to love, the logic of a man who filters out irrelevancies with a natural ease. She kept teaching. Spring came to the valley in 1883 with the same extravagant energy as the previous spring, but its character was completely different to Cora because she was in a completely different place in it. She was in the garden she had replanted in the summer, which had wintered over into good soil, and she was planning the orchard, Ellen's orchard, the one along the western fence line that had always been intended. Joseph had not brought it up, but Cora had found Ellen's written notes in a box in the bedroom closet, detailed, careful notes about which apple varieties did well at altitude, about spacing, about rootstock, and she had thought about this for some time before she mentioned it. "I found Ellen's orchard notes," she said one evening in March directly, the way she said most things. Joseph looked up from the harness he was mending. "I would like to plant it," she said, "this spring. Along the western fence line the way she planned it." He was quiet for a long time. "She would have done it better than I will," Cora said honestly. "But the notes are very good. I think I can follow them." He set down the harness. "Cora," he said, in the tone that she had come to understand meant he was being moved by something and was not sure what to do with that. "She was me's mother," Cora said, "and she loved this land. I think the orchard should be here." He came and put his arms around her, and she let him, feeling the solid warmth of him and the particular quality of his silences, which she had become fluent in over the months. This one was the silence of gratitude mixed with grief that has finally found a shape it can live with. They planted the orchard in April 11 apple trees, 2 cherry trees, sourced from a nursery in Great Falls that Joseph made a 2-day trip to acquire them from. Me helped plant every tree, her small hands patting the soil around the roots with the same careful deliberateness she brought to everything. And when the last tree was in, she stood back and looked at the row of saplings in the late afternoon light and said, with perfect solemnity, "Mama would have liked these." It was the first time Me had said the word mama in reference to Ellen in some months, and the first time she had ever applied any variation of the word to Cora, and nobody said anything about it for a moment. And then Cora crouched down and said, very quietly, "Yes, I believe she would have." By summer of 1883, the property was beginning to look like what Joseph had always intended it to be. The animal shelter held 4 cows and 2 horses, with room for more. The garden was substantial and producing well. The paddock fence was the most sound fencing in the valley. Several passing cowboys had remarked on it, which made Cora privately pleased. The orchard saplings were establishing themselves, small and determined, reaching toward the Montana sky with the quiet ambition of growing things. Joseph had hired a hand, a young man named Carter who came from Wyoming, and had the patient industry of someone who has learned to work without being supervised, which Joseph appreciated. Carter lived in a small cabin he and Joseph had built at the south end of the property, near the creek, and he was respectful and capable, and occasionally brought Me a piece of hard candy from town that she received with enormous seriousness, as though candy were not candy but a formal diplomatic exchange. Cora discovered in the high summer of 1883 that she was expecting a child. She told Joseph on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the morning coffee, Me still asleep down the hall. She told him directly, as she told him everything, and watched his face move through a sequence of expressions: first surprise, then a brief moment of something complicated that she recognized as the particular care of a man who has lost before and is aware of the precariousness of things, and then a warmth so genuine and complete that it rearranged his features entirely. He came around the table and took her hands in both of his and held them the way he had learned to hold things that he valued, firmly but without pressure, with the quality of someone who is paying full attention. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was characteristic. "Perfectly well," she said. "I have been well." "We should ask Dr. Parr. I have already spoken to Dr. Parr," she said. "Last Tuesday. I wanted to be certain before I told you." He looked at her. "You went to Parr and did not tell me." "I wanted to be certain," she repeated calmly. He absorbed this. Then he said, "I am going to worry." "I know. I will endeavor to give you as little to worry about as possible. And if I worry anyway, then I will remind you that I am extremely capable and in excellent health, and you will believe me, and we will continue." He pressed her hands between his and leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture he had developed over the months that she associated specifically with the moments when his feeling for her exceeded what language could efficiently contain. Me, when told, demanded to know immediately whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, and on being told no one could know yet, decided it was a girl and named her already and refused to consider any evidence to the contrary. The autumn of 1883 had a fullness to it. The harvest came in well. The orchard saplings had grown noticeably through the summer. The school had 17 more students than the previous year because 3 new families had come to the valley from the east. Cora taught until the middle of November, when her visible pregnancy and the onset of serious cold made the daily ride impractical. She missed the classroom, missed the students with a specific daily acuteness, and she organized from the farmhouse a system of written lessons that Carter brought into town on his twice-weekly supply runs and distributed, which got her from most of her students the kind of work that proved they could learn independently when they had to. Thomas Joseph Brooks was born on the 4th of January, 1884, in the farmhouse, delivered by Dr. Parr on a morning when the temperature outside was far below zero, and the world was frozen white in every direction. He was born before dawn, and the first light that came through the bedroom window found him in his father's arms, eyes closed, a look of absolute authority on his features. Joseph held his son and looked at Cora, who was exhausted and laughing and crying simultaneously, which is one of the very specific human experiences, and said, "He is," and then stopped because there was not a useful conclusion to that sentence. "He is," Cora agreed. Me, who had been kept at the Callaways overnight and arrived home mid-morning with Dorothea, came into the bedroom and stood by the bed and looked at the baby for a long time with an expression that moved through skepticism, assessment, and then a slow, quiet wonder. "He is not a girl," she said. "No," Joseph agreed. "He is very small." "Yes. I will teach him things," me said, arriving at a decision. "When he is bigger." "That would be very helpful," Cora said, and took me's hand and held it, and me leaned against the edge of the bed with the proprietary ease of someone who has decided that this is their thing to have. Thomas grew as winter babies do, with a particular seriousness, as though having arrived in the coldest month he had decided to meet the world with appropriate gravity. He was a dark-haired, attentive baby who watched everything with Joseph's quality of concentrated focus, and when he first smiled, a real smile, a genuine sunrise of an expression, it was directed at his father, who was holding him in the kitchen doorway in the March morning light, and Joseph's face in response was a thing that Cora saved carefully in the particular memory room where she kept the things that mattered most. The years that followed were the years of building. Not just literally, though there was plenty of that. The farmhouse was extended with a new room in the summer of 1884. A proper barn was raised in 1885 to replace the shelter, a real well house constructed in 1886. But the building that mattered was the kind you cannot measure, the accumulation of ordinary days, of suppers and storms and good harvests and the occasional bad one, of the particular lexicon that two people develop between them, shorthand and private jokes, and the look that means I know exactly what you are thinking, of the way they argued sometimes, genuinely and with full engagement, because they were both people of strong opinion, and the way those arguments resolved, which was always eventually. Always with the honesty that was the central characteristic of the way they dealt with each other. Cora continued to teach. In 1885, the school board built a second classroom and hired an additional teacher, and Cora, as the senior teacher, took the older students and the more advanced curriculum. Several of her early students were approaching the age where some of them would be going to normal schools in Billings or Helena for further education, and she wrote letters of recommendation for them with the particular fierceness of a teacher who takes seriously the obligation to open doors. Joseph's land was productive and growing. He had acquired the additional acreage to the north of his original parcel in 1884, which had given him the range he needed to run a proper cattle operation, 12 head by the end of that year, more thereafter. Carter stayed on, and in 1885 Joseph hired a second hand, a young Crow man named Henry who was an exceptional horseman, and whose presence on the property was the cause of some comment in town, which Joseph addressed by continuing to employ Henry without modifying his position on the subject when pressed. It was one of those conversations, when a man named Garrett who ran the dry goods store had made remarks that were specifically pointed, that Cora heard about second-hand from Dorothea Calloway, who reported it with approval. Joseph had apparently said, with the flat economy he reserved for statements of fact, "Henry does good work and he is a fair man. That is my concern in the matter." And then he had bought his supplies and left without further elaboration, which was entirely characteristic. Henry and Carter got along with the equanimity of two people who are more interested in horses and cattle than in any of the social complications that surrounded those topics, and the property ran well, and the horses Joseph raised from the late 1880s onward became known through the valley for their quality. Me grew up. This is simply what children do, but in the case of me, it happened with a quickness that managed to be surprising even as it was entirely predictable. She was 7 when Cora married her father, and she was 14 when the 1890s arrived, and the girl who had appointed herself the quality control inspector of the Saturday fence mending was now a young woman who had her father's dark coloring and her mother Ellen's way of tilting her head when she was thinking, and who could ride as well as either of her parents, and who had opinions about everything with a fluency that Cora found entirely familiar. "She argues like you," Joseph told Cora one evening in 1891, with a mixture of exasperation and admiration. "She argues better than me," Cora said. "She will be a force." She was. Me finished school and spent 2 years at a normal school in Helena, and came back to Harlow Creek to teach, taking over the primary classroom that Cora had taught for nearly a decade. She took to it with the natural authority of someone who was born to it, and Cora, watching her daughter teach for the first time, me at the front of the room, 20 small children watching her with the specific attention that is reserved for teachers who know how to command it, felt a pride so physical it had a weight to it. Thomas was, by the time he was 8 or 9, a miniature version of his father in his manner, which was not what Cora had expected. She had expected, perhaps, a blend of both of them, and Thomas was that in terms of appearance and intelligence, but in manner he was his father's son, methodical and observant, not much given to unnecessary speech, with a capacity for sustained focus on a single problem that was both useful and occasionally maddening. He was also, to an extent that surprised all of them, gifted with horses in a way that went beyond skill into something that functioned more like communication. Henry recognized it and spent years teaching him, and the two of them could often be found at the paddock in the evenings having what appeared, from a distance, to be a very low-key but extremely focused conversation about something only they understood. By the early 1890s, Harlow Creek had grown considerably. The railroad had inched closer. By 1891 it had come through on the south side of town, and with it had come a different pace, new people, new businesses, the general transformation that followed the railroad wherever it went. The wild open quality that had characterized the town in 1882 was still present, but it had acquired a layer of the organized, the civic, the considered. There was a proper school now, 2 rooms, and a plan for a third. There was a bank and a second hotel and a newspaper. The land itself was changing, and not all of it was easy. The enclosure of the range, which had been a slow process through the 1880s, meant that the open grazing that smaller operators had depended on was disappearing, and several families that Cora had known since her first year in Harlow Creek had sold their land and moved on. It was one of the genuine injustices of the era, the way large interests slowly consumed small ones, the way people who had built something from nothing found themselves squeezed by forces operating at a scale they could not match. Joseph understood this, had watched it happen to neighbors, had made deliberate choices about debt and scale that were designed to keep the Brooks property resistant to it. He did not overextend. He did not borrow against future expectations. He built what he could build with what he had, and he built it to last. In 1892, a drought came through that was serious enough to be the main topic of conversation for the entire summer and into the fall. The creek ran lower than anyone in Harlow Creek had seen it. The pasture went brown and stayed brown. 3 families sold out that summer. Joseph and Cora got through it, the well held. The cattle number was small enough to manage. The root cellar was stocked from the previous good year. But it was a lean time, and they both felt it. What they also both felt was the particular closeness that lean times between 2 people who love each other can produce, the way difficulty, met together, becomes a different thing from difficulty met alone. There were evenings that summer when they sat on the porch in the dry heat watching the brown grass and not saying much. And those evenings had a companionable gravity to them that was its own kind of intimacy. Cora, who was 40 years old in 1895, found that she was pregnant again in the autumn of that year and told Joseph across the kitchen table with the same directness she had employed for the first announcement. And his response was the same, the brief, complicated moment, the care of a man who knows the stakes, and then the warm, complete warmth that followed. "We are not 25, she said honestly. "No," he agreed. "It is somewhat surprising." "Yes," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand and held it. Their second child, a daughter they named Ruth Ellen for the reason that needed no explaining and was not explained, was born in the late spring of 1896, the year Cora turned 41 and Joseph turned 45, and she arrived at dusk on a warm evening when the orchard was in full bloom. The apple trees that had been scraggly saplings in 1883 now mature and heavy blossomed, and the smell of the blossoms came through the bedroom window while Dr. Parr was delivering her. And Cora, holding her daughter for the first time, said, "She is an apple orchard evening." And Joseph, exhausted and emotional, laughed in a way that broke the tension of the previous hours entirely. Thomas was 12 and me was 21 when Ruth arrived, and me, who had always been a young woman who knew her own mind, came from town the morning after and held her sister and said, with the authority of someone who has been an eldest child for a very long time, "She is mine," which was not technically accurate but was not wrong either. Ruth grew up in a world that was already different from the one me and Thomas had been children in, and different again from the world Joseph and Cora had arrived in separately in 1882. The telephone had come to Harlow Creek. The school had 3 rooms. The railroad ran regular passenger service, and people went to Billings and back in a day, which had been nearly unimaginable a decade earlier. The land was more settled, more contained, the open wild quality of it channeled into organized use. But the property itself, the Brooks property on the East Road, retained something of the original character that Cora had first ridden toward on a borrowed horse in the May morning of 1882. The orchard was substantial now, a proper orchard that produced apples and cherries that went to the town market every fall. The barn was large and well built. The paddock fence, which had been remended and maintained every season, was as sound as it had ever been, which was to say extremely sound, because it had been built and maintained by people who believed that the quality of work was not negotiable. In the autumn of 1900, when Cora was 45 and Joseph was 49, me married a man named Will Pearson, a quiet, intelligent man from Billings who had come to Harlow Creek to work as a surveyor and had, through the logical progression of such things, come to know me through the church, found her entirely remarkable, spent 6 months convincing her to marry him and succeeded. The wedding was at the church, the same church where Joseph and Cora had married 18 years before, and Pastor Elias, older now, slower, but fully himself, officiated. Joseph danced with me at the wedding reception in the church hall, the same hall where he and Cora had had their wedding reception, and this time it was me who was carried around the floor while their feet were both touching it, though she was far too old for the carrying version. He held her and they moved through a slow waltz, and Cora, watching from the edge of the room with Ruth on her hip. Ruth was 4 and had opinions about the dancing, and wanted to be where she could see everything, felt the specific fullness of this particular moment, this accumulation of everything that had come before it, the 18 years and the work and the love and the orchard and the teaching and the mornings, all of it present in this single moment of her husband dancing with their daughter. Thomas, at 16, was already beginning to take on the work of the property with the serious commitment of someone who has decided what he wants and is moving toward it without detour. He worked alongside Joseph with the specific ease of a son who genuinely likes being with his father, and Henry, who had been on the property for 15 years and was woven into the fabric of it so thoroughly that the word employee had become entirely inadequate, worked alongside them both, and the three of them had a wordless working vocabulary that was a pleasure to observe. Carter had left in 1893, moved south to Arizona to be near his sister's family, and they had had a proper send-off for him that involved Marvella's best cooking and a general atmosphere of genuine affection. He wrote twice a year and they wrote back, and in 1902 a letter arrived saying he had married a widow woman in Tucson, and the letter had a happiness in it that matched the news. Dorothea Calloway died in 1899, peacefully, in her sleep, as people who have been genuinely good should die. The entire town came to her funeral, and the specific quality of grief in that church was the grief for someone who had been a true comfort, who had taken a frightened little girl in the mornings for months, who had laughed in the paddock that first Saturday, who had been a steady, warm presence for nearly 2 decades. Joseph wept, which he had not done in public since Ellen's funeral, and Cora held his hand through the service. Pete Calloway lived another 7 years after Dorothea, growing very old and very slow, tended by his sons and their families. And when he died in 1906, Joseph served as one of the pallbearers with the straightness and solemnity of a man who is carrying a debt he has been aware of for 24 years. Marvella Poole lived until 1910, refusing to die with the same willful energy she had applied to everything else in her life, and when she finally went, at an age that she claimed was 73 and Cora suspected was closer to 80, she left the boarding house to Cora in her will, along with a note that said, in Marvella's crabbed and vigorous handwriting, "I told you things would work out, and they did, and I expect you to remember who told you that." The boarding house became a matter of family debate. Me wanted to sell it. Thomas thought they should keep it as a rental property. Ruth, 14 by then, had no opinion but strong feelings about the decision. And ultimately Cora gave it to a young woman named Adeline who had arrived in Harlow Creek from Nebraska with very little and a great deal of capability, and who ran it well from that day forward. The orchard matured. That is not a metaphor, though it could be. The apple trees planted from Ellen's notes in the spring of 1883 were bearing fruit every fall by the 1890s, and by 1905 they were substantial trees, old trees by orchard standards, with the gnarled authority of things that have weathered many seasons. The cherry trees produced a crop that me claimed, in writing, as hers annually, and to which she had no actual legal claim, but which everyone agreed she could have because no one wanted to negotiate with me about cherries. In the autumn of 1905, on a Saturday afternoon in October when the orchard was in its harvest colors and the sky was the particular impossible blue of Montana fall, Cora was picking apples from the section of the orchard she had always worked, the Northwest trees, the Wealthies and the Transparents, which were her favorite varieties, when Joseph came and stood at the end of the row and watched her. She looked up and saw him watching her and said, "Stop watching and come and help." He walked the length of the row, unhurried, and she watched him come toward her and thought about the man on the well cover in the spring of 1882, the man who had not looked at her directly, the man with the closed face and the jaw set against help. He was 54 years old now, and the years were on him in the way they are on men who have spent their lives outdoors, a deepening of the face, a particular quality in the way he moved that was slower but not less, like a river that has found its final course. His hair was fully gray. He was, she thought, possibly more beautiful now than he had been then, though she had always found him beautiful even when he was refusing to admit she existed. He came and stood beside her and looked up at the tree and then at the basket she had been filling. "You missed the ones on the east side," he said. "I was getting to those. You always do the west side first. I like the Wealthies better." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of a woman who has been leaning into the same person for more than 20 years, and they stood in the October orchard together, and the light was the color of the fruit, and somewhere across the property Ruth was calling something to Thomas, and the horses in the paddock were making their late afternoon sounds, and the world was exactly the size it needed to be. "Cora," he said. "Joseph," she said. "I have been meaning to tell you something." She turned and looked up at him. He had the expression he wore when he was going to say something that mattered, the full open expression, nothing held back. "That first Saturday," he said, "when you came and fixed the coop," she waited. "I watched you come up the drive and I was going to send you away." He paused. I had the words ready. "I know," she said, "I could tell. But you did not give me the opening," he said. "You just started working," she said. He nodded. He looked at the orchard, at Ellen's trees heavy with October fruit. He looked at the life that was present in every direction, the proper barn, the well-made fences, the house with its extended rooms, the property that had been rebuilt not only structurally but in every way that mattered. "I have thought about that a great deal," he said. "About what would have happened if you had asked first, if you had come up the drive and asked permission." "You would have sent me away," she said. "Yes," he said, "I would have." She reached up and put her hand on the side of his face the way she sometimes did and felt the good planes of it, the familiar architecture of it, his hand coming up to cover hers. "I have been trying to think how to say this for some time," he said, "and I do not have the right words, but everything." He said it simply, without performance. "Everything that is good. It is because you did not ask, because you just came." She looked at him in the October orchard and she thought about May of 1882, the borrowed horse and her father's hammer and a jar of grease for hinges, and the plan that had not been a plan exactly, just the conviction that sometimes you do not ask permission, you simply do the good thing and let it speak for itself. "I know," she said. "I know, Joseph." He kissed her temple, then her cheek, then her mouth, standing in the orchard in the autumn afternoon, and she held him and the trees held their fruit and the light held them both. And the Montana sky above was the kind of blue that does not apologize for being beautiful. Ruth found them in the orchard 10 minutes later and announced that Thomas had said supper was ready, which Thomas denied emphatically at the table, claiming he had said no such thing. And the subsequent argument between Ruth and Thomas carried the meal through its first 2 courses and ended in a draw, as their arguments generally did, while me, who had come for Sunday dinner and had stayed through Saturday because Will was in Helena on surveying work, refereed with the magnificent authority of the eldest child, and Cora and Joseph ate their supper, and exchanged a look above the heads of their arguing younger children that was, in its specificity and its completeness, a whole conversation. That look said, "We built this." That look said, "Look at what we built." That look said, "Remember the well cover, remember the coop, remember the July porch, remember the first coffee, remember the July dark when you held my hand and everything changed." That look said, "This is the thing, this table, these voices, this argument about supper, this orchard outside the window, this particular Saturday in 1905, which is every Saturday, which is all the Saturdays, which is the whole of it." And the whole of it was enough. The whole of it was more than enough. The whole of it was exactly right. The winters came and the springs came and the years turned and the property went on. Thomas married a woman named Louise in 1907, a schoolteacher from Great Falls who had Cora's quality of directness, and a gift for mathematics that had Thomas sitting at the kitchen table with her for hours, the two of them working through problems that no one else in the house could follow. Ruth grew into a young woman of such entire certainty about herself that Joseph said she was the most formidable person he had ever met in his life, and coming from Joseph Brooks, who had met a great many formidable people, this was a significant statement. Ruth went east for her education. She came back. She always came back, because the property on the East Road was where she was from, in the specific way that from Ness operates, the deep grammar of a person's life written in a particular landscape. By 1910, Harlow Creek had changed almost beyond recognition compared to the town Cora had arrived at on the afternoon stage in 1882. The buildings were different, the roads were different, the pace was different. But the school still stood at the north end of town, the same building, expanded 3 times now, and Cora's name was carved into a plaque beside the door that the school board had put up in 1907, which she had argued against and lost. The church still stood. The creek still ran. The East Road still ran east. Cora taught until 1912, which was 30 years of teaching, and she stopped only because Dr. Parr, the second Dr. Parr, the son of the original who had delivered Thomas in the January cold of 1884, told her that her joints were protesting the daily ride in the winters, and that at 57 there was no dishonor in allowing someone else to carry the chalk for a while. She chose her replacement herself, a young woman named Clara who had the same quality of particular competence that Cora recognized, having seen it in the mirror most mornings for 57 years. She handed over the classroom with the thoroughness she brought to everything, organized, annotated, with notes on each current student that ran to 20 pages, and that Clara called the most useful document she had ever received. On the last day of Cora's teaching, a Friday in June of 1912, the whole school, every current student, and a significant number of former students who had heard about it and come from distances gathered in the schoolyard and presented her with a quilt that the mothers of the current students had made together. Each square worked with a scene from the valley. The orchard, the creek, the mountains, the church, and one square in the center that showed a woman on a horse riding east on the East Road at morning, her hat on her head and her saddlebag full. She held the quilt in the June morning and could not speak for a moment, which was unusual for Cora, who generally had words for everything. Joseph, who had driven in from the property for the occasion, stood at the edge of the schoolyard and watched her find her voice, and when she looked over the heads of the assembled children and found his eyes, the look between them was the same as the orchard look, the same conversation, augmented now by 30 years. He walked her to the wagon afterward and helped her up with the quilt folded in her arms, and as he climbed up beside her and gathered the reins, he said, 30 years. Yes, she said. That is a long time to teach other people's children. They were also mine, she said, without sentimentality but with complete conviction. He drove them east on the East Road, toward the property, toward the orchard and the barn and the house with its extended rooms, and the afternoon light was on the grass in the way that afternoon light on Montana grass has been since before there were people to notice it, and will be long after, and the orchard was in its summer fullness, and the paddock fence stood exactly as it should stand, and the whole of the life they had built was present and real in every direction. At the gate Joseph stopped the wagon. He looked at the property, all of it, the full sweep of it, the way you look at something when you want to see it rather than just observe it. This was a disaster when you first came out here, he said. It was in rough shape, she agreed diplomatically. It was a disaster, he said again, without self-pity, just accurately. And you, he stopped. I just started working, she said. He turned and looked at her, and his face was the full open face, every layer of it present and unguarded, the face she had spent 30 years learning in all its variations and all its depths, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his the way he had taken it on the July porch in 1882, the way he had taken it every day since in all the ways that count. Yes, he said, you did. They drove through the gate together, into the life they had built from a coop door and a bent fence, and a woman who did not ask before she started working, into the orchard afternoon, into the good and enduring ordinary of the days that were theirs, all of them, every one.